Well, thanks everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Bill Dempster with 360 Public Affairs, and it's my honor to help introduce and moderate today's webinar. And as appropriate in the run-up to this long weekend where some of us are looking forward to chocolate, we're all in for a real treat. In terms of background, briefly, Life Sciences Ontario has been at the forefront of reviewing federal changes to regulating the price of new medicines and vaccines, and that's been going on for several years, and doing it in a very evidence-informed way, and looking always to work with other stakeholders to unpack what's happening both with the policy and the regulations, but also in terms of how key stakeholders are reacting to or considering these issues as they move forward. And that's why Life Sciences Ontario has recently worked with C.A.R.P, that's the Canadian Association of Retired Persons, to help take the pulse of older Canadians with respect to the federal government's price controls and access to medicines more broadly. And that's what today's webinar is going to focus on. Just a quick logistical housekeeping note. Please have your questions brought forward on the chat panel. It's actually a Q&A panel you'll see at the top. Don't wait until the end of some very short presentations to start typing them in. Please feel free to get them out and circulated earlier. We won't necessarily get to all of you. I know there'll be a lot of questions and comments, I'm sure. But if we don't, we'll do our best to respond to you after the webinar. Second, the webinar recording will be posted on Life Sciences Ontario's YouTube channel and circulated accordingly with everyone who registered to attend today, and look forward to having this shared and further contributing to the conversation. So with that, let me introduce today's panel. And we're going to try to make it a tight 45 minutes too, another extra special gift before the long weekend. In order to help situate and level set on the issue, we've got Dr. Jason Field, who most of you know is the president and CEO of Life Sciences Ontario. So Jason is a bench scientist by training and profession. He has experience in the Economic Development Ministry in the province of Ontario. But for the past 10 years or so, he's been head of LSO, where he's worked assiduously to improve the policy and commercial environment at the head of a huge cross-section of membership that represents life sciences in the province. So Jason is going to help explain the PMPRB, that's the Federal Price Review Board, and some of the other data that LSO has gathered on the issue. I think that will help level set everyone just a bit. Second, we're really pleased to have Bill Van Gorder, Chief Policy Officer and COO with C.A.R.P, also known as the Canadian Association of Retired Persons. And Bill, as you said on our prep call the other day, you've had several full-time leadership jobs recently, even after planning to retire, including as head of the Nova Scotia Lung Association. And we're just thrilled you're going to be here to share back some of what you've heard from your members in the recent survey. And third up, we've got Robin Sully, a retired international lawyer here with me in the Ottawa area, with decades of experience in legal and human rights programs globally. And so, Bill, I think we might have found you a new member if Robin's not already a part. In addition to Jason and I, as I just mentioned earlier, Jason and I are pretty close in age too. I think relevant to this conversation as well, in 2012, Robin was diagnosed with multiple myeloma and is currently co-chair of the Ottawa-Gatineau Myeloma Community Support Network, and works a lot with Myeloma Canada on its advocacy and policy issues, including on the issue that we're going to talk to today. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jason to help level set a bit. Jason, over to you.
Thank you so much, Bill. I don't know what you're talking about in terms of my age. I'm much younger than you. We'll leave it at that. So I think many people on the line today, they're familiar with PMPRB, but I'm just going to do a quick overview and share some data that we've collected as well, and then that'll lead into the C.A.R.P data that Bill is going to present. So if I could have the first slide. All right, so what is PMPRB? This infographic illustrates the very complex pathway that medicines must go through in Canada to actually reach a patient. Health Canada approval for safety and efficacy is really only the very first step. There are then multiple health technology assessments, various pricing negotiations, and formulary approvals. And this often takes 2 years or more before a product is available to the average Canadian patient. The PMPRB serves as the watchdog that looks over this whole process, and they set the maximum price for a patented medicine. And they do this by using a basket of 7 comparator countries, and they set a target price in Canada at the median of these comparators. And that ensures that Canada's not paying too much, not paying too little, but we're just right. And this methodology has actually been quite effective at keeping prices in check. In their own reports, they have stated that general price inflation, as measured by the Consumer Price Index, has actually exceeded the average increase in the prices of patented medicine almost every year since 2003. So for context, this means that the prices that we're actually paying for groceries, gas, and Netflix is actually rising faster than the price of medicines by about a factor of 10. Next slide, please, Bill. So what are the changes that are being proposed? I think it's important to recognize that there are actually 2 major changes. So as I described initially, the PMPRB used the G7 basket of countries as comparators initially. And the first proposed change is to change these basket of countries and to actually remove the 2 highest priced countries, the US and Switzerland, and add 6 additional countries with the goal of really putting us at the middle of the OECD. So this is a much different approach than what we have seen in past. And the net result is about a 20% lowering overall of prices across the board. The second and much more problematic change is the introduction of what's called economic factors. This is a complex set of equations that target what is deemed high-cost drugs, which are either drugs that are high cost or actually have large markets. So they're actually in high demand products. And they further reduce the prices by as much as 50% or more. This is important because many of the newest therapies, particularly for cancer and rare diseases, are personalized medicines and inherently more expensive. The problem, aside from the unreasonable price reductions, is the lack of clarity and uncertainty that these economic factors introduce. The PMPRB has the power to apply these factors whenever and however they choose, including retroactively. And this level of market uncertainty, it really puts Canada as a global outlier amongst other developed nations, and really is a barrier to new drug launches and investment. And while these changes are now official, the implementation date has been delayed several times, but even so, we're already feeling the negative impacts. Next slide, please. The most worrisome of these impacts is, of course, the delay of new medicine launches. Since these regulatory changes were first proposed, the PMPRB has insisted that there's no linkage between the price of medicines and launch decisions, or investment decisions for that matter. But you don't need to be, Warren Buffett or an economist to recognize this runs counter to basic business principles. So we asked the leading health data research firm, IQVIA, to look at new drug launches globally versus those in Canada over the past few decades, and whether there have been any changes. And what we saw was that in the year 2019, when these regulations were launched, we actually saw about a 40% drop over the long-standing trend. Now, it's important to note that the PMPRB has disputed these results because they like to use approval data. But what we have seen is that drugs that are approved are not necessarily marketed in Canada. So it's not reflective of medicines that are actually available to Canadian patients. So what IQVIA uses to differentiate this data is actual sales data, meaning that the products are available. And this also excludes any Me Too products or reformulations. So it really is focused on innovative new medicines that are available to Canadian patients. The results show that Canada typically receives most new medicines within 1.5 to 2 years of first global launch, which is actually pretty good on the global scale. And this trend really does hold true, with the exception of the sharp decline in 2019, when we saw only 13 new products come to Canada when we should have seen closer to 30. And we attribute this directly to the introduction of these regulations. Next slide, please, Bill. We also thought it was important to understand how Canadians feel about this issue. And we are going to hear from Bill shortly regarding polling data from C.A.R.P members. But I want to share the results from an early survey that we did of 1,000 Canadians, and we commissioned this survey with Ipsos. Not surprisingly, it showed that many Canadians are not familiar with the PMPRB, nor do they understand the changes and the potential impacts. This is a pretty specific, complicated issue, so I don't think there was any surprise here. But when we asked directly about the accessibility of new medicines versus price, 2/3 of Canadians say they would be willing to pay a little bit more to ensure they have timely access to these new treatments when they need them. That was a concept they could get behind. We also did an anonymous survey of global and Canadian pharmaceutical executives, and 96% said these changes will negatively impact drug launches in Canada, with 1/3 saying that they've already delayed or canceled the launch of a new medicine here. And 90% say there will be negative repercussions to investments in innovation, employment, and clinical research. In fact, we know of one of our members already that has reduced their headcount by 30% because of these changes. Next slide. It's important to understand that PMPRB is really a symptom of a broken relationship between the industry and government. There's been several recent media articles detailing the industry's outreach to Prime Minister Trudeau, only to be rebuffed. The government has been obstinate in their assertion that these changes will take place and continue to deny any negative impacts. But then COVID has come along, and the implementation of these regulations have now been delayed multiple times. And in fact, one of the early things that the government did in response to COVID-19 was to create an exemption for COVID vaccines and treatments to the new PMPRB regulations. So this is clearly an admission that Health Canada knows these regulations are a barrier to new medicines. Why else would they feel the need to make this exception? But if this is the case, then the question that we as Canadians should be asking is, will there be exception for my cancer therapy, for new medicines to treat my chronic illness? And unfortunately, that does not appear to be part of the government's plan. So with that, I will say thank you, and I'll hand it over to Bill to continue. Bill, you're on mute.
Sorry, thank you. I'd like to give you the high-level results of what C.A.R.P found in its survey, and it was in the context of these really concerning developments that Jason has outlined that C.A.R.P realized that the future access to new medicines in Canada was in jeopardy. So C.A.R.P undertook a survey last month, next slide please, for which the results have just become available. Next slide. We wanted to understand the perspective and experience of Canadians about the value of medicines and drug pricing, and we wanted to contribute to this really important policy discussion, especially for older Canadians across the country. So we conducted the survey in January, and the objective was to make sure that policymakers were aware of how the voters actually felt about these. Next slide, please. We had over 3,600 survey responses. In fact, 3,642 in all, from across the country, from all provinces and all the territories except for the Northwest Territory. So this was a broad and solid survey. We had more female respondents than male, and probably unsurprising since it went out to C.A.R.P members and those on our mailing list. 83% of the respondents were 65 years of age or older. 11% were 81 or older, and but there were 15% who were below 65, our newest older Canadians. And this, of course, reflects the fact that C.A.R.P seeks to attract members between 45 and 65 age group, because that is the growing percentage of our population. Next slide, please. So before asking respondents about their views on access to medicines, we also wanted to gauge their general knowledge of the health system. We asked them general questions about the health prescription drug system, and the results showed the respondents were knowledgeable about some issues, but not about others. For instance, most of those surveyed, about 57%, believe that half of healthcare spending goes to pay drugs, when actually, according to CAI, in 2019, non-hospital drugs accounted for about 13% of the total health spending, and patented medicine only 6 to 8%. And that percentage has remained pretty stable over the years. Next slide, please. There are three main things that our respondents to the C.A.R.P survey told us. First, they said their prescription medicines are valuable to them and give them great benefit. Secondly, they said they were worried. They were worried about the impact of the new federal drug price controls, and worried that they'll have some issues with access to new vaccines and new treatments. And thirdly, they said that they really believe the federal government should reconsider the new drug pricing rules. They wanted to ensure that any rules didn't impede access to new vaccines and new treatments. So how can we say with confidence that's true? Well, here are the numbers. Next slide, please. Strong majority of the survey respondents were very clear in terms of their concerns about the issue. First, as noted before, older Canadians believe medicines are worthwhile because of the benefits they provide. Over 80% of our members responded and told us that Canada should be among the first countries of the world to have access to medicines. We asked this question two ways. We said, should we be among the first countries to receive new medicines, and should new medicines come here at the same time as they do other countries? And you can see the response to that. A small minority said it's more important to have lower costs than access to new medicines, and that really was a small minority. Finally, 4 in 5 respondents, so 80% or more, said federal government should reconsider price regulations, and we believe this is a clear message to our politicians that they are really on thin ice on this issue. There are a couple of other important things that I'd like to mention. Jason mentioned in his presentation the federal government was concerned about the potential negative impact of their own pricing rules and regulatory procedures on COVID-19 vaccines and treatments, and they exempted COVID-19 products from their own rules to speed things up. Well, we pointed this out in our survey and asked respondents what they thought and why the government was doing this. And as you can see, 2/3, 65%, told us that if it was necessary to ease drug pricing rules for COVID and medicines, this should be applied to all vaccines and all medicines to speed access to Canadians. And it was about a quarter who felt that COVID was a special case, and that regular rules shouldn't apply in that case.
You muted yourself, Bill.
Sorry about that. Bad hand, put it down. Our survey also asked the respondents to give some of their ideas, write their own thoughts and comments. We received many comments, and this is just a small sample, but they reflect some of the themes that came up in comments. One is that people felt strongly that Canadians should have timely access to new medicines and new vaccines. Others felt it was important that the same treatments should be should be paid for in every province on an equal basis, that your postal code should not determine the level of health care that you receive. Comments also noted that new treatments for uncommon or rare diseases are particularly important to older Canadians, since there are very few, usually very few options. And others made it known that they're very concerned that the government's pricing and policies are flawed and will have negative impacts. So we thanked all the Canadians who took part in the survey, and we want to make sure that everyone understands that C.A.R.P members, older Canadians across the country, are very concerned about the impact this is going to have on our access to drugs and vaccines.
Thanks very much, Bill and Jason. That was terrific. Robin, over to you. And I'm actually going to stop sharing the slides, because that's about it for anything we have to put up on the screen. So, Robin, over to you for your thoughts and reactions on this issue.
Well, thanks very much, Bill. And I must say, I'm very encouraged by C.A.R.P's survey and the results of their survey. Good morning, everybody. I'm really pleased to be able to participate in today's webinar and to have been included in this panel. I'm a multiple myeloma patient, as Bill mentioned, and as many of you know, multiple myeloma, often simply referred to as myeloma, is a cancer of the plasma cells found in the bone marrow, which, among other things, impacts in the body's ability to fight infection and ultimately results in death. The cause or causes of myeloma remain unknown, but multiple myeloma is considered a rare disease, representing only 1% of cancer patients in Canada. Yet, based on the 2017 incidence rates of myeloma provided by the Canadian Cancer Society and the annual population growth projected by Statistics Canada, about 290,000 Canadians alive today are expected to develop myeloma at some point in their lives. But despite this growing prevalence, and many among older Canadians, myeloma remains relatively unknown. Although there's not yet a cure, as a result of the newly available drugs, the disease is becoming more treatable, with many patients being able to lead full lives for years after diagnosis. However, increased research and access to emerging treatments remains essential to improve the outlook for myeloma patients. For my part, I was initially told I could expect to live 3 years. I have now passed 8 years since my diagnosis and happily appear to be going strong, thanks to the miracle and availability of innovative drugs. However, the drug cocktail I'm currently on is failing, and I'm looking for the next lifeline, which, if I am lucky, will involve a clinical trial. And I'm not alone. This is the plight of all myeloma patients. And from a myeloma patient's perspective, I cannot overstate the importance of having access to effective drugs. That is, the right drug at the right time. And in myeloma's case, the need for a range of drug options as the disease is constantly changing. Affordability of drugs is important. This is an accessibility issue. From an accessibility perspective, this means that drugs need to be priced in a way that they are reasonable, both from the payers and pharma's perspective. And this is a negotiation process, which raises the question, will the new PMPRB regulations and guidelines facilitate that negotiation and the establishment of reasonable pricing of drugs in Canada through its use of new comparative countries for list prices, attempts to foster more transparency in determining net prices, and ongoing monitoring of the market size and clinical effectiveness of drugs? It's not clear. However, affordability is not simply a question of cost. It is a question of questions of value to the patient in terms of extending and improving their quality of life, to their families, and to our broader community in terms of sustaining our broader social values of investing in the life of our citizens. And in that regard, the relative cost saving to our health system of investing in innovative treatments, including drugs. Research is critical and is also an accessibility question. Clinical trials provide opportunities for patients to be treated with the newest drugs. Patients are concerned that pharma will not continue to invest in research in Canada if the proposed negotiation process for determining prices does not ensure some certainty or reasonableness in pricing. In this context, Myeloma Canada is concerned, and I am a patient, am concerned, that the proposed PMPRB changes will not facilitate the negotiation of drug prices that are reasonable and ensure the certainty that pharma needs to introduce drugs in Canada in a timely manner. While the changes to comparative countries, increasing transparency and monitoring the impacts of drugs is important and can effectively contribute to the negotiation of drugs, the negotiation of reasonable, sustainable pricing, the current proposed guidelines need to be tested to ensure that the processes set out actually accomplish this result. In their recent joint presentation to PMPRB, Connected, an oncology network with Save Your Skin, Lymphoma Canada, Lung Cancer Canada, and Myeloma Canada, asked a health economics expert to look at a number of oncology drugs for different types of cancers that had recently been reviewed by PCODER, and with the information publicly available to him to compare the outcomes they received through that process with the outcomes he could predict they would have under the proposed guidelines. 6 drugs were selected and were analyzed by an expert as case studies. In 2 cases, the impact of the guidelines was minimal in terms of pricing changes required and probably would not have changed the decision about whether or when the drug would come to market in Canada. However, the other 4 drugs analyzed were judged as very unlikely to make it to market in Canada under the proposed guidelines. In the particular case of daratumumab, a drug used in combination with Revlimid, I can't even pronounce my own drugs here, and dexamethasone or bortezomib and dexamethasone for the treatment of patients with multiple myeloma who have received at least 1 prior therapy, a 70% price reduction was estimated from his best guess of the current price, or an equivalent internationally visible price at around 80% below the publicly submitted price. And it was therefore concluded that it would be very unlikely that daratumumab would have been submitted for consideration of supply into the Canadian market. This would have been a huge concern for myeloma patients who are currently on this effective protocol. And for me personally, who will be looking to this combination now that my current drug regime is failing. The case studies demonstrated that the use of this one blunt health technology instrument, the single criterion of ICLR, will generally not make it a practical economic business decision to bring a drug to Canada, or at least not to put it high on the list for applications relative to other countries for market entry. Certainly a concern for all oncology patients. In light of these results, a patient group submission concluded that it's clear that oncology needs its own approach to the PMPRB guidelines, as the federal and provincial governments have recognized in other health policies. This approach must be flexible enough to recognize the difference between uncommon and more common cancers, different stages of cancers, genetic factors, pediatrics versus adults, comorbidities, indigenous populations, and social determinants of health, just to name a few. While this blunt instrument may be workable for some diseases, they felt that the case study analysis clearly demonstrated the need for a more nuanced, flexible, and pragmatic instrument for oncology drugs. They also felt that CADI's deliberative framework for oncology drugs with 4 considerations, including clinical benefit, cost effectiveness, patient values, and feasibility of adoption, recognized this nuanced, flexible, and pragmatic health technology assessment required for these drugs. This is a recognition that there are limitations of using a single outcome measure for economic evaluation, since in doing so, important health consequences are excluded. INIS also, in Quebec, also takes into account public and patient values in its health technology assessment consideration. From a patient's perspective, this is an essential input. Based on these conclusions, the submission went on to make specific technical comments and recommendations for the proposed PMPRP guidelines. At a minimum, I would suggest that a more iterative process that ensures the coordination of all the agency at the federal, that is Health Canada, CADA, PMPRB, and provincial level needs to be considered in moving forward. Other treatment alternatives also need to be considered as we move into precision and personalized medicines, C.A.R.T, and other immunotherapies. Despite the concerns raised by a number of patient supports groups, it appears that the proposed changes to the PMPRB guidelines will move forward in July of this year. At this point, the options seem limited. At a minimum, a robust monitoring and evaluation process engaging all stakeholders will be essential. The results of the C.A.R.P survey are really encouraging and suggest support for a political alternative, increasing healthcare and specifically treatment and drug budgets to reflect the needs of a growing and aging Canadian population. And those would be my comments moving forward.
Robin, that was incredible. Thank you so much for sharing. You know, you were earlier struggling with the one of your drugs that you're on in terms of the chemical name for it. But did you ever think, did you ever think that you would have to become an expert, not just on that, but on all of this health policy stuff too, and then be able to get your head around the economics, et cetera? It's on top of actually fighting multiple myeloma. You've had to learn all these other things. And honestly, I think the myeloma community is very fortunate to have somebody with your skill set, background, and capacity to be able to support. So thank you for sharing your story and what it actually means on this issue.
Thank you, Bill. What I have to say, there are many patients who are involved. I'm just one of many, and I think we're all on what I would call an exponential learning curve, because this is really complicated. It's a complicated system, and and you know, in some way that's a way of controlling the drug prices by making it difficult for us to engage in a meaningful way.
Yeah, you need a dictionary beside you while doing it, right? Well, let's open it up to some discussion within the panel. And so I've got a few, potential questions we can start with, but please don't hesitate to throw your hand up. And of course, the question box is open for any of the listeners to contribute as well. My first question, I think, is back to Jason, and Robin might have hinted at some of the answers around this, but why is there a disconnect between what Health Canada and PMPRB say are the impacts or non-impacts of this, and what a lot of other external stakeholders are saying in raising these flags? What is the source of that that disconnect from your perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bill. And just before I answer that, I'll have to say to Robin, I'm an organic chemist by training, and I can't pronounce half of these names. I'm gonna suggest that maybe, because I know there's a few pharma representatives on the call today, we should just ban organic chemists from contributing to the naming of drugs going forward. And I'm saying that as an organic chemist. Yeah, no, it's a great question, Bill. I think that the disconnect really comes from a couple of areas. Number one, I think there's just a broken relationship between the industry and the federal government. There's a lack of trust, and I think we need to find ways to work together to rebuild that. And I certainly think that COVID-19 has exposed that a great deal, that disconnect. The other piece I think is really important is that there are political agendas driving a lot of this. So we know that the current government is really committed to a national pharmacare program. They're trying to find ways to afford it. And I believe that these PMPRB regulations, which I think blunt instrument is the best description anyone can make of these, is really key for them to achieve what they think is affordability. What we worry about is that it's going to result in a situation where we have a great national pharmacare program with no drugs to go into it. So yes, there's a great deal of disconnect. I think there's an unwillingness, and has been an unwillingness to actually engage with stakeholders. not just industry, but patients as well on this particular topic, because it's being driven through ideology versus good evidence-based policymaking.
Thanks, Jason. Now over to you, Bill. You know, for you, listening to Jason and then hearing from your members, you know, what's your key takeaway for the federal government? And that's come up in the questions as well. What would you say if you could say one thing to the key minister or even the prime minister if they asked you about this?
Well, and we are going to be speaking to them, and we are going to say this, and that is that, as you saw from the survey and in our discussions with our members, C.A.R.P members really want a balance between competitive pricing and regulations. They don't want complex regulations that nobody understands and don't appear to be they know going to be effective in the long run. They know that those just create price uncertainty and discourage new medicines, both being made in Canada and being sold in Canada. And we really need to have a balance. Older Canadians are tired of being the ping pong ball between levels of government and others, and of saying to come to the table, discuss it, and make sure that the drugs that we need are available. And that's a strong position that we're going to continue to tell our elected politicians and their leaders.
Thanks so much, Bill. I might come back to that because C.A.R.P is so active on all the issues that affect older Canadians. Just to ask if there are any parallels to, you know, some of the other issues that C.A.R.P is really involved in, because you mentioned you're a ping pong ball. Are you managing to stop that move? Do you find that there's traction there?
Well, we are finding, unfortunately, that COVID has really made ageism rear its ugly head once again, and we're finding and we're hearing from our members across the country, governments stop making decisions for us, make them with us, and make us a part of the discussion. As Robin was saying, with patients in general, and certainly with older Canadians, we want to be a part of these discussions, and we don't want to be surprised by something like this PMPRB process, which many of us just really began to realize was there back last fall, when it had been underway for some time, and no discussion had been had with, C.A.R.P represents, we have 325,000 members across the country. We're the largest advocacy organization for older Canadians in the country, and the government didn't even think of coming and discussing this with us in any way until others brought it to our attention. And now they're hearing from us. They're hearing from us by letters, by correspondence, by meetings with them. I spoke to the federal minister of seniors just the other day and mentioned this to her in our conversation. But the other thing that we're going to do, and I would encourage everybody watching this webinar today, it's fine for the four of us to talk about what's needed at this level, but decisions only change and governments only react when the people who vote for the people who are elected know there's a concern. So everyone, and we're asking all our members to get in touch with your local member of parliament, tell them that you're not satisfied with what's happening in this decision process, and you want change, and you want to make sure there's continued equitable access to drugs and vaccines across the country. And if we can mobilize our people, as we have on other issues, to tell their elected officials, we won't vote for you unless you do this, then we'll get reaction. That's really what C.A.R.P tries to do in terms of involving all our members in our advocacy.
Thanks so much, Bill. And this is a related question for you, Robin, unless you want to jump in on anything Bill said. But one of the things that we were preparing for and getting ready for this panel was, I think, one of the tougher questions, because we noted that this is a complex issue. So, but I wanted to bring it back to you, Robin, to try it out. But anyone on the panel can jump in. You know, the Uncle Bob at the Thanksgiving table or something like that says, "What is this all about?" You know what I mean? What do I say to Uncle Bob? Robin, what do you say to a person that you haven't seen in a long time, that is bending your ear and heard you on your webinar today and said, what do I need to know and what can I do about this? How do we explain it in a little bit less complex way from your perspective?
Absolutely. Well, just before I respond to that, I'm not sure I can respond effectively to that, but I wanted to jump in what Bill just said in terms of the budgets. I think this question is really important. The presumption is in this that the federal government, nobody wants to increase their health budget. Well, this is absolutely ridiculous, because we've got a growing population and a growing aging population and more incidents of cancer. So we need more treatment. And the idea that somehow we should not be expanding our health budget in these circumstances, I think I'm encouraged by C.A.R.P's response that people have said, yes, increase it. Don't feel that you've got to be limited to your budget, because this is an important Canadian value. And these decisions are not being made in that broader policy framework, I don't think, which is another issue. They're bureaucratic with respect issues being made to control costs. Finish. That's my concern with respect to Bill's answer to Uncle Bob.
Let me just briefly build on that while we're on it, and then we'll get to the really tough question. We did a recent review of the Health Canada departmental priorities and their goals, and it's specific in there to keep the drug budget at less than X%. I think it's even 1% of GDP, 1 to 2%, and then they said this is where it's at. There's nothing in there, and this is what we see actually in Europe and the United States, where they have offices of innovation where like attract new investments in rare disorder drugs, or you think about Joe Biden's moonshot for cancer. And I think that's what we need here, is to be more inspiring and forward-looking and in that direction, as opposed to just looking at the dollars and cents. What's the expression about being penny wise and pound foolish?
Pound foolish, exactly.
Yeah.
I think I absolutely agree. I think we look at it as an investment in our population, not as a cost, because I think it's a different approach.
And as the C.A.R.P survey pointed out, there's been some real misinformation that's been promoted to people, that somehow the costs of vaccines and drugs is a huge part of the system. As we know, they thought, our members thought that up to 50% of the cost of healthcare in Canada was drugs, when it's only 6 to 8%. So an increase in that is peanuts compared to the rest of the budget. And the other thing that is misrepresented is the cost that we actually pay as citizens is determined much more by the plans each of our provinces have, which are much different from province to province, which is another issue. That's where the costs impact citizens. It's not at the kind of level that they're talking about. So that argument doesn't hold water, and people have to understand that.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Bill. Before we get into that final question, because I think that's a good way to end it. What would you say to what do I have to say to Uncle Bob? Okay, I'm a little bit invested in this myself, but Jason, there is a question in the panel because we are talking to principally to LSO members. I don't know if you saw it. Have you heard about the impact on this in terms of smaller biotechs and academic research groups? That's a question for you for sure.
Yes, absolutely. And there will be impacts. I mean, one of the physicians of the PMPRB is they track R&D investments within the innovative pharmaceutical community. And that's part of the reporting requirement, because there was a commitment when PMPRB was formed that the biopharmaceutical companies would invest 10% of revenues back into Canada. Now, they use what's called the SHRED credits. It's a tax credit mechanism to track these. That was valid 40 years ago, but over 4 decades, the business has evolved, as all businesses evolve. And we no longer have a pharmaceutical industry that is solely vertically integrated, where everything happens soup to nuts within the same organization. Research is global, and the partnership that happens between the pharmaceutical industry, academic researchers, small startups in biotech, it's not captured in these shred credits. And so what PMPRB is actually capturing is only about half of the actual investments in R&D that are made by the industry. So there are huge impacts, and we're starting to see those already. And in fact, we've got domestic companies like Medicago in Quebec, for example, that are developing a homegrown, made in Canada COVID-19 vaccine. And they're speaking out about this because they will be impacted by these regulations. And they've invested so much time, energy, and money into the innovation ecosystem here in Canada. And their products and all of those efforts aren't being appropriately valued in the consideration by PMPRB.
Thanks very much. So I've actually not kept us to time because I was going to aim for 45 minutes and be out at 12:45 Eastern. I know we're not all in the same time zone here, but let's wrap it up with my Uncle Bob challenge. I don't have an Uncle Bob. I'm protecting the innocent, by the way, by using that. But I'm hoping we can say at the end of this, Bob's your uncle, and really nail it. Who wants to try it in terms of somebody sidles up beside you at, remember buffets? We used to have buffets. Yeah. And says, can you please explain this to me? Robin, do you want to take a go?
Sure, I guess so. Well, I'd be happy to see Uncle Bob again, quite frankly. I think I'd start by saying, well, it is very complicated. I'm not sure I understand it all myself, but I would say that the PMPRB is established as a regulatory body. It was initially established to ensure that drug prices were reasonable and to report on research investment in Canada, because we were giving longer patent protection to drug companies, and we simply want to make sure that companies did not take advantage by having unduly high prices. But the recent concerns about the cost of drugs has resulted in the PMPRB trying to expand I guess its role, regulatory, but the function now is not so much reasonability, but to the reduction of costs. And that's a concern to patients and to all of us, because focusing on costs may reduce our accessibility to new drugs. And with a growing and aging population, when we should be investing more, we have a risk where we're not going to have the access we need with these new regulations. And that would be my concern, and perhaps should be your concern, Uncle Bob, too, as you're looking at this. That's what I would say.
I think he's nodding his head. He's not shaking it in wonderment anymore. Jason or Bill, any final words on either that or the webinar?
Well, I do have an Uncle Bob, and I hope that I could put it as clearly as Robin has. And I would just add to what I remember she said, to say that C.A.R.P members really want a balance, and putting complex rules and regulations into that is just going to make things more difficult for all of us, and to create uncertainty, to discourage innovation in Canada, to discourage production, is going in absolutely the wrong way. And that's what these regulations would do if they came to place.
Thanks so much, Bill. Jason, I'm going to pass over to you. Final comments on that, and any take us home comments.
I think the Uncle Bill question is a really good one. And in my experience, as I've talked to all of my Uncle Bobs and Uncle Bills, I actually have an Uncle Bill, so I'll say Uncle Bill. And we have two Bills on stage too. So there's two things that come up repeatedly. Number one is, right now during COVID, most people can relate to the experience that many people in the rare disease and oncology community feel every day. And that's waiting and not having the timely access to the medicine that they're anxious about and that they need. So making that connection, I think, is important because it kind of puts it into perspective. The second thing that I think is really important is that there's a lot of misinformation out there around the price and cost of medicines, and this perspective that, you know, pharma is just this profit-mongering, faceless set of corporations. And so I spend a lot of time telling my Uncle Bill about the people that I work with and their dedication to creating new medicines, and actually provide some data to show that, you know, these corporations aren't the richest corporations in the world, not even close. You know, if you look at the Fortune 500, for example, J&J, the biggest pharmaceutical company in the world, doesn't even crack the top 100, right? So it's how do we put it in perspective in terms of the companies that are making these life-saving medicines, and what is actually fair pricing for the products and the value that they bring. So it's really a discussion around that and listening and answering the questions that are being asked.
Thanks very much. Jason, any final words from LSO in terms of this webinar or next steps or anything?
Well, I just want to thank Bill from C.A.R.P for their partnership. It's been absolutely wonderful working with you. Robin, for sharing your perspective, your lived experience. The patient view is just so central and important to everything that we do in these conversations. So thank you for bringing that. And Bill, of course, thank you for moderating all of us and providing all the support that you have to our organization on this very important issue. And thanks to everyone for attending today.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.